All right. Thanks so much for joining us in this course. I think we will have a lot of fun. Hopefully learn a lot. It's a very heterogeneous group, both in terms of where you are in your academic progress and in terms of your substantive interests. I will say that most of what we're up to is, I think, independent of subfield. A good paper is a good paper, and having a clear research question is an important feature of a good paper, whether it's in trade or development or labor or public or whatever. This is me. This is my shiny new title. I just started at the University of Wisconsin in January. Paul C. Hain is probably somebody you've never heard of, unless you used a textbook called The Economic Way of Thinking. He was my undergraduate mentor. I would not be a professor or an economist without his influence, and I had the opportunity to pick the name of my named chair, so I picked his name. My dissertation advisor, well, I also could have picked here, but I have this thought that you should not name your chair after somebody who's still alive. That's kind of old school. My dissertation advisor, as I'm sure you know, is Jim Heckman. So this is a Heckman student and a Heckman grad student talking to you here. So I'm kind of a labor economist, I guess, but one with very broad interests. So don't be shy about telling me about your topic in macro or trade or development or econometrics or whatever. I think you'll find Jess has pretty broad interests as well. Our plan for the course is today we're going to talk at you, and then tomorrow and the next day you're going to talk at us, basically, and also to your peers. And what we want to do today is kind of lay some groundwork for how we think about the process of developing a paper idea, executing a paper, discussing it and presenting a paper, and then that will form a foundation, we hope, for what happens on the next 2 days when you tell us about your research ideas, and we give you feedback, and you give each other feedback, and we're going to formalize the notion of you giving each other feedback a little bit, as we'll discuss later. So there's many levels here as you listen. Not so much to the two, right? We're going to do 2 lectures. I'm going to lecture on where the papers come from. Jess is going to lecture on how to give a good presentation. Then we're going to do I'm going to present a paper of mine, the one that I'm currently presenting in departmental seminars and in conferences, basically to Jess, with all of you watching. And she is going to, as economists do, interrupt me and ask questions. And we will go back and forth. Now, you can consume that part of today's activities at several levels, and I think you should consume it at several levels. One level is, maybe you're invested in the paper. It's a paper about the economics of education in developing countries. But you should also consume it as thinking about the choices that my co-authors and I made in how we developed our paper, the choices that I made in how I'm presenting the paper, and the choices that Jess is making in critiquing the paper. So there's the substantive level, and then there's the organizational and presentational levels, if you like. And we want you to sort of carry that over to tomorrow and the next day, when you all are presenting your presentations to us and to each other. One of you may be up here talking about international trade. Maybe you think international trade is boring. I think it's pretty interesting. I think all parts of economics are pretty interesting, but I have broad interest. Even if you think the topic isn't so interesting, you can still pay attention to how they're framing their argument. Right? How are they making their case? How are they stating their research question? Those kind of meta skills, if you will, are the most important things we want to emphasize during this course. Of course, about how to write papers, how to present papers. Not about applied econometrics. I do those courses too. Not a course about the substance of development economics or labor or anything like that. It's really a course on conducting research. And so there's always this mix of the substantive and the methodological. You should feel free to stop us and ask questions. Raise your hand. If either of us speaks too fast, which is, I think, our natural state for both of us, is to speak quickly. I'm trying to go slowly. I know from past experience that's what I want to do. But if we go too fast, just raise your hand. Say slow down. That's fine. It's much better for you to slow us down and understand what we have to say than it is for us to zoom along and leave you behind. All right. So where do papers come from? Yeah. A very simple outline to this talk: ideas and then execution. And a lot of this talk is about ideas, where paper ideas come from. Because my perception, I've been on, amazingly, 99 completed dissertation committees. I was the chair or the co-chair on about a quarter of those. Guess was one of those. That's a lot of dissertation committees. I've interacted with many students whose committees I was not on. I am on a number of unfinished dissertation committees. Jess, too, has interacted with quite a few students at Maryland. And so a lot of what you're going to get from us is based on our experience interacting with PhD students at Michigan, Maryland, Wisconsin, and Western Ontario, which is where I started out. All right, what you think now is time is plentiful, paper ideas are scarce. They're hard to come by. You're like gold, be treasured. What you will think in a few years, time is scarce, paper ideas are plentiful. And so part of what we want to do in this course is speed the transition, not necessarily from time is plentiful to time is scarce, but from paper ideas are scarce to paper ideas are plentiful. Because indeed, there are many, 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 many interesting papers to write out there in the world. And you will reach a point in your graduate school career where you make this transition. You may even make it consciously. And you realize, why did I think this was so hard? Now I've got this whole file full of paper ideas that I don't have time to write. Why did I think this was hard? But it is hard when you start because you don't know how to do it. When PhD students come to my office for the first time, sometimes they'll have a paper idea, sometimes they have no paper ideas. But usually what I have them do is I have them go away and come up with a bunch of paper ideas. And this usually frustrates them. And indeed, it scares some of them away. They go talk to somebody else for a while instead. But I want to kind of shock them into realizing that they need to get good at this paper generation process. So I send them away to get 5 paper ideas. And for each of those paper ideas, I want them to confirm, if it is an empirical paper, it usually is, if they're talking to me, that the data exists to do the paper and can somehow be obtained by them, perhaps, to confirm that someone has not already written the paper. And you want to find that out early, not late. Sometimes you should proceed anyway. Maybe you can do a better job of the paper than the person who already wrote it. But oftentimes you want to stop and do something else. Once you've got your multiple paper ideas, you want to run them by several people. Now, sometimes the student will come back and it's clear that some of their ideas are just not happening. But other ideas, maybe I'm not so excited about the idea, but my colleague down the hall might be excited about the idea. Different people have different tastes. Different people have different ideas about what would add value to the literature. So I encourage students, when they have an idea, to run them by multiple, they should be colleagues with you, faculty. Nobody likes it, don't do it. If some people like it and some people don't, then you have to think hard. Do you feel lucky that day? Maybe you want to rank the ideas that you've come up with and start with the ones that everybody's excited about and then move to the ones that are more mixed. Conduct ongoing review. This is something that I have not probably been as good at as I should have been over the years, right? So there's a country music song, know when to hold them and know when to fold them. And that refers to poker. Actually, that's what that song is about, right? You have a hand of cards in poker, and as you play the game, you get a sense of how strong the hands of the other players are, and you have to make a decision about whether you keep betting or you stop. Papers can be like that. Sometimes a paper seems like a good idea, you get started, you get the data, you do some analyses, maybe you learn that the data has a flaw in it that you didn't anticipate. Maybe you discover another paper that's kind of close to what you're doing, but not exactly the same thing. Maybe another exciting idea comes along that you should work on instead. It's really important not to get stuck with the sunk cost fallacy in your paper writing career. Whatever time you have put into a paper already, that time is sunk. You have spent it. Standing where you are now, you need to think, okay, is it worth whatever time and effort it's going to take to finish this paper relative to what I could use the time for instead? And sometimes the answer to that question is I should stop and never touch what I've done again. And learning that skill of which projects need to be killed and when, which projects need to go to completion is tough. Again, I have probably finished some things I should not have finished. I have probably started some projects I should not have started that were not the best use of time. One of my colleagues at Wisconsin, Bruce Hansen, said that any paper that gets less than 100 Google citations was a bad decision. That's a high bar, actually, 100 Google citations in your paper. But that's the bar he uses to decide ex post whether he wasted his time or not, or spent his time optimally or not. You may come up with your own criterion, but you should be thinking about this as you go. Just because you start a paper, just like a book. Just because you read the first chapter doesn't mean you have to read the whole book. Just because you start the paper doesn't mean you need to finish it. You're going to hear a lot about research questions from Jess. I'm trying to reinforce that sort of in advance. A good paper idea seeks to answer a precise research question in a new way. Precise research question. Now, I've done graduate admissions a couple times, and one of the interesting things about doing graduate admissions, people reading applications to a PhD program, is that in their personal statements, people will often explain what it is that they want to research. They'll say, I'm very excited about economics. I really want to come to the University of Michigan or Wisconsin or wherever it is, and I'm going to study blah, 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 blah. And blah, 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 blah is usually something like automation, or I'm going to rewrite the Wealth of Nations for the 21st century, or something equally diffuse and ill-defined. Right? So that's one of the things we want to combat today, is that kind of diffuse, ill-defined thinking. We want to put you onto precise research questions. Another terminology that people use is that you want to make a real contribution to the literature. So you want to raise a new question that people are interested in, or answer an old question in some way that is useful, that advances our state of knowledge. Sometimes that will be a big contribution, sometimes it will be a little contribution, but it needs to be some contribution. Right? Simply doing what has been done before is not generally a contribution, because that's already been contributed. So learning what people think of as a contribution is helpful, and that's something we're going to try. That'll be a theme in our comments tomorrow and the next day on your research ideas. Will be, is that a big contribution? Exactly how does it contribute? And framing this is really important to that too. The same piece of empirical work, written up in different ways, can be a major or a minor contribution depending on how well you do at connecting it to different literatures that people are interested in. So this is something that Heckman is a master at. He's a master at understanding what different literatures a piece of empirical work adds to, and then writing the empirical work up in a way that illustrates, that makes clear the contributions of that empirical work to all the different literatures. A final feature of a good paper idea is that you can actually execute it, right? You can do the theoretical work necessary, you can do the empirical work that's necessary, you can do the statistics that are necessary, the econometrics, or you can attract a co-author who can do those things, right? We're all about division of labor in economics. You don't have to do everything yourself. It is true in the US, I'm not sure this is true in China or not, it's true in the US that I think people under discount co-authored papers, right? So you come up for tenure, you have 10 papers, they're all co-authored with one co-author, let's say. There's a sense in which that's just 5 papers, right? If you take each paper and divide by the number of co-authors, each one of those 10 papers, so 2 authors, is half a paper for each author, but that's not really how it happens. And we can have a discussion, this is maybe something to discuss over beer or over lunch or something, about what the right discount rate is for co-authored papers. But my perception, and most people I talk to's perception, is that co-authored papers are a bargain. That it's a good thing to have co-authors. Not just because you sort of can get 2 papers in the time it would take to do one, but also because you learn from your co-author, right? You can have a co-author who brings skills to a paper that you don't have, or that would be very costly for you to learn. You have a built-in referee, right? I think papers that are written with co-authors tend to be better before they go to the journal, because the co-authors do it back and forth with each other. That makes them more likely to get published quickly. It's a nice thing. So, you need to be able to do it, or your co-authors need to be able to do it. Plus, there was a plug in there for having co-authors. I have 0 sole-authored referee publications. So that's out of like 40. So I follow my own advice. A friend of mine in grad school, who I've lost touch with, was called Brian Bowen. And I don't think this was original to him, but I learned this from him. He had this notion that there are 4 kinds of papers. Now you'll see there are 6 things on the list, that's because I've added 2. First, I will tell you about the 4 kinds of papers that Brian Bowen defined. I found this very useful, actually, the way to frame types of contributions. So, and he had a hierarchy. So 1, 2, 3, 4 is the hierarchy of Brian Bowen. First one is fill in the blank. What is a fill in the blank paper? A fill in the blank paper is a paper where you do something that somebody already did, but in a different place, for example, or for a different industry. So I went to a conference in Eastern Europe around the turn of the millennium, where I saw somebody present the first earnings equation for Slovenia, right? That is a fill in the blank paper. I'm going to estimate an earnings equation for, and then there's a blank, and you fill in Slovenia, right? And that's great. You've got this whole literature on earnings equations in other countries to draw on. You're extending that literature by applying it in a new place. In industrial organization, you might say, well, those people studied the cereal industry with such and such class of model. I'm going to study the yogurt industry with such and such class of model. And hopefully, and this will make it a better paper, a bigger contribution, there's some reason to think that the yogurt industry might shed some light on how well the model works more broadly. So it's not just, oh, I came up with another industry, but it was an industry chosen for some academic reason to shed light on the workings of the model or on features of the data. Connect the dots. Children's game, right? Where you get the thing with the dots and you connect them to make a picture. Connect the dots means that you take one thing from one literature and another thing from another literature, and you put them together. Right? Oh, those people over there in that literature literature, they've been doing randomized controlled trials, those wacky development economists. I'm over here in energy economics. Maybe I'll do a randomized controlled trial too. I'll study time of day electricity pricing, or I'll study incentives to conserve energy in other ways. That's connected dots. A lot of methodological arbitrage takes this form, right? So traditionally, microeconometrics shows up first in labor economics, and then it diffuses into the other applied micro subfields. So the whole revolution around heterogeneous treatment effects. What if the coefficient on the variable of interest has an I subscript and varies across people? Right? That all took place in labor 20 years ago. It's still working its way through public finance 20 years later. I had a student at Michigan called Caroline Weber, who wrote a treatment effects, a heterogeneous treatment effects paper in public finance. And some people thought that was really cool. Other people thought, no, that's weird labor stuff. I still think it was really cool. Extend the line. Take an existing line of research and move it forward. Right? Improve the model. Improve the data. So on and so forth. Right? That's pretty clear. That's probably the most common one. Create a new line. This is something that's mostly for famous people. Okay? So Gary Becker started the economics of crime. And that's pretty good. That's creating a new line. Gary Becker, he started the economics of the family too. That's pretty good as well. James Buchanan, he started public choice economics. That's a very big notion of creating a new line. There can be smaller notions, right? Jim Heckman. Economists had paid very little attention to child development for a long time. It's not that nobody had done it, but he kind of brought it together and showed how it integrated with other things that we talked about, with our models of human capital and so on. He kind of moved it from being very much on the back burner, like the fifth row back burner, up to the front burner. Got people excited about it and explained why it was important. I think that goes down here too. Right? Or think about early in his career, right, the bivariate normal selection model. That has created a whole line of methodological work that he has continued to be active in. Right? Factor models and all that stuff are all intellectual descendants. The whole marginal treatment effect framework, that's all intellectual descendants of that original work on the bivariate normal selection model. If you can do that, that's great. You can create a new line, buy lunch. That's what you want to do. I've added two things to Brian Bowen's list of four. One of them is replication. Now, I said before that you don't want to do exactly the same thing that somebody else did. And I think in general that's true. I think it's generally agreed that real science, and we can have a discussion about whether or not economics is real science. I think we should aspire to be real science. Does replications. Economists, not so much with the replications. And I think that's too bad. But the way you can do a replication in economics and have people pay attention to it is if it's a replication and an extension in some important way. Right? So maybe there's some paper that looks at the effect of human capital on growth using data from 1970 to 1995, and you say, I will replicate that paper, but I will also add data to 2015. That's a replication and an extension. Sometimes when you replicate, it turns out that the paper was wrong, the one that you replicated, that there was some sort of mistake. There's been a couple of exercises in economics on replication. There was a special issue of the Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking, I think back in the 1980s, where they tried to replicate a bunch of papers. There were 8 of them. 2 of them were replicable fully. Several of them completely fell apart upon replication. The others were somewhere in between. You know, sort of the qualitative point of the paper still held, but the numbers weren't really right, or didn't replicate. There were a couple famous experiences of replication in the US. So the story is that David Card used to have his students do a replication for his class. And they would pick famous papers, and one of his students, Justin Prairie, my former colleague at Michigan, he replicated one of Steve Levitt's papers, where Steve Levitt used the timing of mayoral elections in cities as an instrument for the size of the police force. Because he observed that mayors tended to increase the size of the police force in the period right before their election came up. And when Justin replicated the paper, it turned out there was a programming error. And the main finding, its stars went away. It wasn't statistically significant anymore. Steve Levitt behaved actually reasonably well, I think, in response to that. This is the hard part when you replicate and things don't go well. You have to contact the author. And the author does not want to hear from you about how their paper did not replicate. They were very happy with their paper when it got published. There was another student of David Card's, Jesse Rothstein, who replicated a famous paper by Caroline Hosky. And that ended up in a bunch of name calling and things like that. And that was bad. Nobody comes out ahead. And I worry that episode and a couple other episodes, my former colleague David Alboui, again in David Card's class, replicated the settler mortality paper by Jerome Asimoglu and others. That did not go well, that replication exercise. The authors that he had replicated did their very, very, very best to suppress his replication paper, which eventually, 6 years later, got published in the AR. So now you're thinking, why does anybody ever do this after I've told you all these horror stories? Well, A, we report to the assignment, which we should be doing it. B, it's a very good first paper, and I think this is why David Card did it in his class. Because if you replicate, the paper idea thing is off the table, right? You're just redoing somebody else's paper idea. So it's just a way to learn how to go get data, clean the data, try to match the data to the descriptive statistics in the paper, and then repeat the analysis. And that's a useful learning tool. So I've thought about having a class with replication, but I've never done it.
So I have all of my second year graduate students do a replication and extension. But the point of replication does not have to be overturning the original paper. We should be neutral as scientists approaching this, and we want to go back. So if you're a chemist, it's understood that you write up an experiment and you share your protocol with other labs, and other labs see if they can follow your protocol and get the same reaction. And that's part of the scientific process. And so there's a push to add that to the scientific process in economics. And I think that's good for the state of knowledge. But I also think that when we write replications, it's very hard to publish a paper that says, I did the same thing as these famous people using their data, and I got the same result. That's hard to publish. So people look for something that would make it more interesting, more surprising. And therefore, they might look for a reason that the replication doesn't work. So one of my professors and Jeff's former colleagues used to say, if you run enough regressions, one of them will eventually break your heart. And this comes from Charlie Brown, a labor economist at Michigan. And that's the idea, that people would really go specification searching, looking for a way to undermine the result. And that's not good science. And so the point when I assign a replication, it's for the reason that Jeff said, to learn mechanically how to write a paper. And that's a theme I think you're going to hear from us in the next 3 days. frameworks that as students you should master before you try to innovate. That you want to learn the process. How do you go through forming a research question, cleaning the data, organizing the data, structuring your paper and presentation. And once you master those, then you can have more freedom and flexibility. But learning to start with that framework is very helpful.
Exactly. The last type of paper that I put here on the list is reviews and meta-analyses. So reviews and meta-analyses attempt to digest existing literature and make sense of them. I think my sense is that economists underdo these, and they're a little hard to publish well. There's also this focus always on new, instead of digesting old. And so there's a lot of wheel reinventing that goes on that nobody seems to mind. So be it. Sometimes I will suggest to students, once they've found a literature that they're interested in, but they don't have a precise research question, that they review the literature. They write a literature review as a way of forcing themselves intellectually to think about, okay, what are the key questions in this literature? What is the existing evidence on those questions, and what is the quality of that evidence? And what questions remain open? Digesting the literature and that really sitting down and writing it out is very useful. It also can be part of your dissertation when you get there. But it's a way to sort of think it through. Now, some people can think it through without the writing. Other people have to sit down and write it out. General remarks on paper ideas. Write about things you are interested in. This is pretty standard advice, but sometimes I see students not do it. And the reason they don't do it is because they're worried about a hot literature or a hot subfield. So right now, what's hot? In the US, what's hot is environmental / energy, which is sort of one thing, because energy messes up the environment. What else would be hot? Development, not so hot anymore.
No.
Yes, it was. Labor, definitely not so hot.
No, I mean, probably trade shocks.
Trade shocks, yes. Immigration, very hot at the moment. People get excited. Yes, well, I have some here. Skill bias technical change was hot, not so hot anymore. Now we're all on about automation. Right? Inequality, very hot, pickety, blah, 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 blah. People all excited about that. Migration. Lots of politicians concerned about migration. Lots of voters in different places concerned about migration. The gig economy, I should have put the gig economy up there. Everybody wants to write an Uber paper. Or some paper, or mechanical turf. You can just say mechanical turf during your talk that improves your job prospects and other things. You know, there's two things here. Write about things you're interested in, write about things other people are interested in. Hot literature, there are things that other people are interested in right now. In a way that's very good, in a way it's not. The downside to writing in a hot literature, which is why I never wrote a paper about skill bias technical change, is that there's a lot of competition, right? You're competing with David Carr and all these other really smart people. Now that's fine, pushes you to be really good, but they're pretty smart. So you need to think about that.
Well, and they're fast.
They are, well, compared to me, always that's true, yes. I will tell a story about Ed Glaser. Some of you may have heard about Ed Glaser. He is a tenured full professor at Harvard, very distinguished scholar in urban economics, very smart guy. I went to grad school with Ed Glaser. And my understanding, from stories that people who knew him better than I have told, is that he sort of sat down and said, all right, I'm interested in urban economics and I'm interested in labor economics. In labor economics, there's a lot of really smart people. Urban economics is kind of a backwater at the time. If I go into labor economics, said Ed to himself, I'll be a pretty good labor economist, but I won't be the top labor economist. On the other hand, if I go into urban economics, said Ed to himself, I will be king of urban economics. And indeed he is king of urban economics. And indeed he has helped bring urban economics off the back burner into the forefront of economics. But that was a decision not to chase a hot subfield at the time, but instead to go into a backwater subfield and try to make it hot. So I've written here, write in the literature that's going to become a hot literature. Go into a subfield that's going to become a hot subfield. It's great if it's because of you, but even if it's because of somebody else, that's still good for you. Yes?
How do you identify?
Well that's the hard part. I don't know. I don't have a way for it to tell that. Economists are notoriously bad at forecasting, so I don't have a good strategy for you there.
Well, except if you have some way to be the first person to get a big data set.
Yes.
So the first person to get access to the Uber data, right, has a real advantage. You get to write the first paper that everyone cites, and you get to take on the biggest question, and everyone else has to do something that's a little bit different.
Or you're Raj Chetty, and you're the first person to get access to the income tax data in the US, right? And then it's like an open, virgin forest. You can just go down and start cutting down the biggest, best trees. And, yeah. So my point here is not so much to tell you what to do, it's to tell you, to give you some sense of what you should be thinking about. Now, I've been very fortunate. I started writing papers about college quality in the late 1980s at a time when that was a literature that nobody paid much attention to. Now we're all very excited about college quality and college match in the US. That became a hot literature through no fault of my own. Yes.
But here's a way to think about it. In development economists who use randomized controlled trials have known for a very long time that one of the weaknesses of using randomized controlled trials is that they may not be externally valid. So they might not tell us what happens in another place, or they might not tell us what happens at scale. So thinking about using experiments and the very good internal validity, the identification that comes from them, to write about equilibrium effects is something that people are just starting to do. Chris Udry and Mark Rosenzweig are doing that. A few other people are doing that. And they're brilliant, but it was clear that this would become a hot literature because it was a problem that everyone knew was out there that we were all choosing to ignore because it was hard. And I think in some ways, college quality was a problem that people studying education knew was out there in the literature, but previously hadn't chosen to.
That's a very good, yes. Sometimes you can tell what's, now, right, sometimes people aren't doing something because it's really hard, right? Or nigh impossible. And, you can butt your head against that wall and hurt your head and not make a lot of progress. Now, people are making progress on the scale enough. I should say, since Jess has given me the opportunity, I have a paper in labor economics land that uses a randomized control trial to learn about how well a search model performs at generating estimates of the equilibrium effects of an active labor market program. And that paper, which has never been published, it's a long story, again, over lunch or over beer, I can tell you the long story about that paper. It does circulate as an NBR working paper, and it has 150-some Google citations as an NBR working paper. And in labor, it's one of the sort of founding papers of that literature. And again, everybody kind of knew in labor too that if you evaluate a training program, that there were some spillover effects, probably. You get people excited, they take jobs, some of those jobs would have gone to other people. And those effects, those are equilibrium effects, probably aren't zero. But much of the literature proceeds with what I think of as a false folk theorem of empirical economics, which is things that are hard to estimate equal zero. And that's not true, don't write that down like it's true, but we often act like that's true, that things that are hard to figure out must be zero. So yeah, I will accept Jess's modification to my point here. Sometimes we do have some sense of what's going to be a hot literature, because there are these issues within some epistemic community, some little literature, that everybody has for the moment agreed to ignore. Right? I read a definition once of an epistemic community, which is a set of researchers who've agreed not to ask certain questions. But those questions eventually get asked, and being a mover on one of those questions can be very valuable, both to the literature and to your group. Now, at Michigan every year, we had a series of lectures for the third-year PhD students. And each week, a different faculty member would come in and talk to them about getting started on their research. Because in most US PhD programs, you spend your first 2 years taking classes. Right? Your first year, you take micro, macro, econometrics, then there's high-stakes exams, then you take field courses, then there's field exams or field papers. Third year, you get down to writing papers. You switch gears. And every year, we would have this debate, because I would come in to this lecture and tell the students that they should read the literature, and one or more of my colleagues would come in and tell them not to read the literature. And so I want to say a little bit about reading the literature. Why it is that some people think it's good advice to students not to read the literature, and why it is that I think it's good advice to the students to read the literature in a specific way. Right? And that's an important caveat. So, the reasons that people give for encouraging students not to read are two. One is, start with this one, it's easy to fool yourself that you're getting something done when you're not. Right? You could spend years, there's a lot of literature. You can read and read and read and read and read and think, oh, I'm working all day. I'm working so hard, but no papers ever come out. All that comes out is reading. You want to avoid that. So there's an optimal amount of reading. Right? There's, in my view, a hill-shaped function, and you want to get to the top, right? The other thing that people will argue is that if you read the literature, then your thinking will be constrained by it. That the existing literature will shape and narrow how you think about the possibilities of answering the research questions you're interested in. I can see that, I think, for high theory, maybe, right? If you're going to come up with some brilliant new theoretical framework for stuff, maybe it's better to be ignorant. But for the vast majority of empirical papers that you might write, and even for the vast majority of theoretical papers you might write, not knowing the literature means you're very likely to waste your time. And that's my concern here. Reasons to read the literature. Number one, avoid reinventing the wheel. Right? Avoid doing what other people have already done. And then you act like it's new, and then somebody, some crusty old person tells you that they were already doing that back in the 60s. That's what my cohort got. Now you would get people telling you they were doing that back in the 90s, I guess. The other thing is, you want to understand what people are excited about in a given literature, or the current controversies. And it's hard to do that without reading. So, my advice is to read, but to read in a particular way, which is to read with a focus on what isn't there. And that's not a way that we're usually used to reading. Right? We're used to reading to try to absorb and memorize what is there so that we can reproduce it on an exam. I'm suggesting a different way of reading that involves more active engagement with the material. The way of reading that tries to see, okay, what's missing? Now I'm going to go through after this and talk about a bunch of strategies, sort of narrowly defined strategies for coming up with paper ideas. Several of those strategies have to do with different things that might be missing in a paper. Now, the author typically is not going to put up a big electric sign in their paper that says, hey, here's what I'm not doing. This is why this paper is not as good as it could be. Or this is why this literature is not as good as it could be. But you, as the reader, can think about that by reading with an active, engaging mind. By questioning, why did they do this way? Why didn't they do it the other way? Sometimes there'll be a good answer. Occasionally, the author will even tell you why they did it the way they did it, but often they don't, which is too bad. But you can think about it, and sometimes they'll say, oh, I see why they did it this way. But other times you'll think, oh, actually, I think I would have done it this other way. And sometimes, oftentimes, doing it the other way will make a difference, but sometimes it really will. And so it's that kind of questioning, engaged reading that I want to encourage you to do. Not reading to absorb and spit back, but reading to see what's not there. Reading to understand the choices that were made and the choices that were not made. And maybe those are the choices you want to make. Another thing, so I was a precocious young person when I was growing up in the late 60s, very long time ago. I would watch lots of documentaries on television about poverty. People were very concerned about poverty in the 1960s in the U.S. President Lyndon Johnson started a war on poverty. Right? People were, there was, in a way that they're not now. Right? Now nobody's much worried about poverty. It's a long way from those documentaries to the fact that 4 days ago I became the Associate Director of the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin. Right? So that's something I've been interested in for a long time. Write about things you're interested in, do things you're interested in. But it also tells you that sometimes you can get inspiration, not just from academic literatures, but from documentaries, or long-form journalism, or perish the thought, actual books. I think that my work has been made better because I'm a relatively broad reader. That I read things outside of my very narrow interests, and sometimes things out there make me better at thinking about things that are in my narrow interests. At Wisconsin, I have not interacted with students a lot, but I have interacted with some students, and they have a habit of reading literature very narrowly. So I'll be looking at the bibliography. It'll be yet another paper about early childhood development of non-cognitive skills. We're very excited about that at Wisconsin. And the same 5 authors will be there on all the papers. And I'll say to the students, well, you know, there's more people than those 5 that write about early childhood education. They'll say, really? Yes. And I'll point them to some of the papers. You know, I am at a department that is very structural in the way that economists use that now. I'm a diversity hire in some sense, right? So I'm an ecumenical but mostly design-based or reduced form person. And, you know, these students need to see that there's value to them, even though they want to write a structural paper or think they're supposed to write a structural paper, in reading the design-based literature. So,
if you don't know the difference between structural and design-based or reduced form, come and find me at lunch, and I'll explain the difference.
Just out of curiosity, how many people don't know that distinction? It's okay.
Yeah.
We're all sinners, whatever. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we can talk about that at lunch. That could be a whole lecture by itself. If Chao Fu were here, she was just down in Guangzhou. She gives an excellent lecture on the distinction between structural and design-based. All right, so now I'm going to go through this list of paper-generating technologies. So this will have more examples. This will be more concrete. That's my idea. Everything so far has been reasonably broad. This is going to be relatively more concrete. So there was a PhD student at Western Ontario called Hao Ming Lu. Fine guy, he's at Hong Kong somewhere. And I remember the first time he gave a seminar, he was very interested in how worker quality varies over the business cycle. And at the time that he was starting to write his dissertation, the literature on how worker quality varied over the business cycle had not reached a conclusion. There were papers, serious papers that said it was pro-cyclical, serious papers that said it was counter-cyclical, serious papers that said it was acyclical. What he originally proposed to do in his job market paper was to write down a model that assumed one of those answers was true. That assumed the literature had reached a conclusion and then did stuff with that. That did not go over well in the seminar. People said that's crazy, right? Why would you assume a controversial finding? Why don't you instead try to sort it out? Go to that question, what happens to worker quality over the business cycle, and try to figure out why these papers get all different answers. And that's kind of what he ended up doing for his job market paper, which was very successful, right? Because it took an existing literature on a question that was well defined, what happens to worker quality over the business cycle, where there were mixed findings, and he wrote down a more general framework, applied the framework, and showed within the framework how you could get the different answers if you knew what the other people did. That's a good paper. Right? It published well. I think enjoyably. So that's one way to develop, and that's why I said on the previous slide, learn the controversies in the literature that you're interested in. Maybe you can resolve the controversies. That's a good thing to do. Another example, Robert Moffat, very famous labor economist and public finance economist in the US. He was best known in the earlier part of his career for writing papers about welfare programs, about cash transfers for single mothers in the US. And there's a literature on the effect of the generosity of cash transfer programs on how many children are born outside of wedlock, out of marriage. And that literature had a bunch of papers that all found small effects consistent with the standard economic model, which is when you make the benefits more generous, people have more children out of wedlock, and one paper that didn't. And so he replicated the paper that didn't. Sure enough, it had an error. When you fix the error, every paper in the literature agrees. That's a real contribution, right? You go from a literature where there's some controversy to a literature that speaks with one voice that you can take to policymakers and say, oh, here's kind of what the profession thinks. So, knowing what the controversies are is a way to generate paper reviews. Think about ways to try to resolve controversies in the literature. Sometimes there will be papers whose results you think don't pass the smell test. Now, does everybody know what the smell test is? Sometimes it's called the laugh test. So some results just don't seem plausible. That's what that means. That's what the smell test means. You look at a result and you say, nah, that can't really be right. You know, so if you see a paper that evaluates a training program and the training lasts for 2 weeks, and the claim in the paper is that it raises people's earnings by 10%, you say, no, there's something wrong there. That is not right. We have this literature over here on the effect of years of schooling, right? 9 months of instruction. Well, we're pretty clear that the average effect of a year of schooling is like 7%. There's no way that some 2-week course is going to give you 10%, right? If there were such a course, somebody would have found it already and would be doing it, right? So that's an example of the smell test or the laugh test. There's a result that just doesn't make sense, given what we know about the world, or given what we know about theory. Another way to put it, if you're a Bayesian, is it's a result that strongly conflicts with an informed prior. You know, all those results aren't false, right? People had strong priors about the Earth being flat. People had strong priors about the Earth being the center of the universe. Those were wrong. But oftentimes, if you have an informed prior, you question these results. So, my paper with Petra Top, my second best cited paper. We were responding to a paper by a couple guys called Adhesion and Love. Fine folks. They had taken a data set from an earlier paper by Robert Lalonde, who was on my dissertation committee, a very famous paper. This was the first paper that used a randomized controlled trial as a benchmark to study the performance of standard non-experimental econometric procedures in program evaluation. So he had an experimental evaluation of a training program. He covered his eyes, said, suppose I didn't have the control group from the experiment. Suppose I just took the treatment group from the experiment and compared it to non-participants drawn from other data sets. That was a second article in the AR in 1986. Right, second article in the journal. Great paper, 1,000 and some sites. The Adhesion Law would come along and they say, oh, well, Lalonde, he didn't try matching estimators. He just did all this linear model stuff. That's all old-fashioned. We're going to do matching estimators. And we're going to kind of play around with the sample and do some other stuff. But we're going to emphasize the matching estimator part. And lo and behold, they get much better performance of the non-experimental estimators than Lalonde did. And so they say, matching is wonderful. Matching solves your problems. This is fantastic. Now, Petra and I, because we've been doing work again in another program, comparing experiment to non-experimental methods for another program, we were pretty sure that this shouldn't work. We had a pretty strong and well-informed prior from the work we had done on this other program that said that given the set of characteristics they were matching on, they shouldn't be able to get rid of the bias from non-random selection due to the training program. And sure enough, we showed in our paper that if you poke the results on a bunch of different dimensions, they go away. Now, they replicate. This is important. If you do what they did, you get what they got. But if you do something a little bit different, you often get something very different than what they got. And that is the message of our paper, is that their wonderful finding, which got people very excited, too excited, I think, about matching methods, was a knife-edge result that depended on details of their setup. So, that's an example, right? Here's this paper, it got a lot of attention, but the results seemed wrong to us. We had an informed prior, they seemed wrong. And so we investigated, and sure enough, they weren't wrong, but they were very sensitive. Here's another example. Enrico Moretti, tenured full professor at Berkeley, smart guy. He has a very famous paper in which he runs regressions of individual earnings on stuff, right, characteristics of the individual, plus the fraction of people in the individual's city who have college degrees. He gets a whopping big effect. Wow, this is great. I mean, everybody's got to move where people have lots of college degrees. Paper published in the Journal of Econometrics. So I was a referee for this paper. There was another referee too. Most of the referees wrote really long referee reports. Mine was like 10 pages long because I did not believe this result. It just seemed implausible to me that the spillover effects could possibly be as large as he was claiming that they were. And the other referee also wrote a very long report with different comments than mine, some in common, some different. Moretti did all of them. His response to the referees was a very long document, right? We'd each written like 10-page referee reports. It was this hugely long document of responses to the referees. He did everything we asked, and the result didn't go away. So at that point, I said to the editor, can you publish the paper? I still don't believe it. I still don't believe that the spillover effects are that big, but I think you publish it and hope that somebody else comes along, somebody more clever, and figures out why they're not right. Because my prior is still that they're not right, that there's something wrong there. So that's a paper idea for you all, right, is to figure out why these results in Moretti aren't really right. Yes?
How big was the why was it so, why did you not do it?
You could, going, I don't remember the exact number, but do you remember?
I don't, but it turns out when you compare it to the return to an individual's own education, it just, I have to look it up.
But it seems implausible.
It seems, yeah, it's just too big compared to, if we think that the coefficient on a year of schooling for yourself is between about 0.07 and 0.1, then the return to the schooling of other people around you should be smaller than that, right? Unless agglomeration effects, which is what he's writing about, are, so unless the complementarities between workers are even more important to productivity than workers' own individual skill, and that holds true even netting out the competition, right? The fact that more educated workers should drive down wages. And so I don't remember the number, but I remember looking at it compared to the 0.07 or 0.1 that we know from the literature about the returns to your own education.
Yeah. So this is, again, this is a free paper idea. I'm handing out to you, because I never had time to do it. It's on my long list. I have this long list of paper ideas. I'll probably be a professor for another 15 or 20 years. Even if I stuck to paper ideas I've already had, I won't finish them all, which is kind of disheartening.